Welcome to Talking with Tech. My name is Chris Bouguet, and I'm here with Rachel Madel. How's it going, Rachel?
It's good. Busy little bee over here. I am.
So guess what, Rachel? You and I kind of sleep on this sometimes because we often record banters maybe a week or two, the little segment before the interview, a week or two, or sometimes even 3 weeks before the actual episode plays. And so sometimes it's hard to kind of schedule things, especially milestones that have happened. But I did happen to notice that we have surpassed 100 episodes. Did you see that?
No. I had no idea where you were going with this. I was like, what's he about to say? Oh my gosh, this is so exciting.
Yeah, I recognized about an episode or two, or maybe 3 episodes ago, a couple episodes ago, is when we passed 100 episodes, which is quite a milestone, I think.
It's really interesting to think that we started this podcast. It's almost 2 years, actually, we've been doing this podcast.
That's another milestone. So in November will be our 2-year anniversary. So that's another thing.
I know. And to think about how much it's grown. I remember 2 years ago when Asha was in Los Angeles, Lucas and I walking around, we had just started the podcast. We only had a few interviews and we were trying to get people to come on the podcast, which is so funny now because I feel like now you guys just send us emails with people to interview and ideas. And it's just really cool to see how it's all unfolded.
Now, speaking of stuff that's going on, so one of our most recent episodes was an episode that talked about aggressive behaviors. You kind of opened up and explained a story that had happened to you, and we kind of talked about it here on the podcast. And since then, a lot of people have reached out. Is that a fair statement?
Chris, you would not believe how many people have messaged me. And I've been flooded with love and support and emails saying people not only, their hearts go out to me, but they completely understand similar things happen to them. And so it's just been really wonderful to see everybody who has sent me messages and reached out on social media. I mean, I've gotten so many emails and it's been really wonderful to not feel so alone. And I have to be honest, I had this pit in my stomach the day that episode aired because I just felt like it was so raw and real and I was very vulnerable in talking about that. And so I'm just happy that it ended up really helping, it sounds like, a lot of our listeners. And it was just a constant reminder that we're not alone and we all experiencing these things and we all have self-doubt. And at the end of the day, it's important to talk about these things. It's important to say it out loud because then you realize, I'm not the only one who feels this way.
So yeah, I think a lot of people empathized with that because the profession is very caring and giving, and you give a lot of yourself. And so, I don't know, it seemed to touch a lot of people.
Yeah, it did. And just a quick update on the situation, because,
yes, exactly.
It's not just a podcast episode, it's like my real life. The situation has unfolded in a way that has been beautiful. I have transitioned some of my clients to more of a consultation, parent coaching model. And it's actually been really wonderful because I think at the end of the day, that's where I can be the most value to a family, is to really help them troubleshoot, to teach them the concepts. And so it's something that I kind of had this nagging feeling that was kind of eating away at me anyway, because I felt like I wasn't utilizing myself in the best capacity for these families. And so actually I've had a lot of really great meetings since then, and I feel really good and inspired about how I can help in a way that I feel good about and families feel good about. My biggest concern was that families would feel disappointed and let down. And I never want to feel like I've let somebody down. And, we talked about on the episode how that was one of the emotions that was driving a lot of, my feelings regarding this, because I felt like there's so many clinicians that give up on these families, and I can understand that from the clinician perspective, right? It's hard work, but how can we figure out a way to still support while also kind of preserving ourselves and our energy and, our physical beings. So it's been really good. And I feel really good about kind of how everything has unfolded since then. And luckily, I don't think I've disappointed anybody.
So are you still working with the family then?
Yes.
You just changed how you're working with the family.
Yes. And again, this is typically what I do, right? Typically what I do is kind of coaching and going to schools and all these things. It's just a lot of times people get my name and they think, well, we want Rachel to work with our son or our daughter. And I have said yes to that, knowing that eventually I do want to kind of transition them to more consultation, coaching, but I think I just kind of let it go on for a little bit too long. And anyway.
Maybe it's even reframing the questions. So when someone comes and says, I want Rachel Madel to work with my son or daughter, really it's, I want Rachel Madel to work with us. Right.
Yes.
Because you said, no matter how much time you have, it's a small fraction compared to what the parents will have and the other support personnel surrounding that student. So that makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah. And I think that that's a typical speech therapy model, right? Is to come every week to an office. And so that's what most people are used to, but I don't do things the way that most people do them. And, I'm very clear with that with families in the initial stages, but I think sometimes I actually do need to work closely with a student while I'm trialing and kind of figuring out a student before I can be of most value. And so it's trying to figure out, like, how can I learn about the student, trial some technology, figure out where we need to start, all in the same process as, having clients. Because it's hard to kind of manage it all. My time's really slim. And so I think it's easy to kind of fill people into the slots of my office, but I don't think it's actually the best practice. And so I've been trying to figure out how can I figure out my schedule so that I'm able to go do a home visit and a school visit and all these things, at least initially, so that I'm able to then maybe transition to more telepractice, coaching, consulting, things like that. So it's just been kind of trying to figure it all out.
Hey, I could save you a lot of money, Rachel.
How, Chris? You know I love saving money.
Here's how you do it. Just get rid of the office. Work out of your car. Drive from place to place. Don't pay rent anymore for the office space. I do feel like that is, I'm joking, of course, but really, could you see someday down the line where that doesn't need to happen anymore? That you don't need to have a place for people to come? Or do you feel like, no, you still need it for some certain times or certain activities?
Well, you know what it is? It's a few things. It's Los Angeles is not the place that you can be in a car. It's so hard to get from one place to the other. And so I was finding, because that's how I started my practice. I started my practice only doing home visits, only going to schools. I didn't have an office. And the reason I ended up getting one was because, one, I was super burnt out from all of the traffic and all of the sitting. And, I feel like I was perpetually late, which is never a good feeling. And especially because I'm pretty punctual. So it was like there were these things outside of my control that were impeding my ability to be on time and, all those things. But also I just wasn't able to see as many kids. And so I'm really able to maximize my time. So it's this balancing act, right? Like I need to be able to maximize my time, but also I need to integrate into a home environment, into a school environment, which I've always done. And it depends on the student and their, what we're working on and things like that. There's so many things that go into that decision. But yeah, I only have office hours Tuesdays and Thursdays. So I'm not in my office every day for that specific reason. But it's this balancing act.
Well, you heard it here first, folks. We know what we need to get Rachel for the holidays or for her birthday. It's going to be a helicopter. We're going to get you a helicopter to fly around LA.
I would love that. I need a helicopter. Actually, I thought of hiring a driver. I really have, because I was like, I feel like I could sit in the back seat of my car and work while somebody else drives me around.
Yeah, right? Like a Lyft or an Uber or something like that?
Yeah.
Just someone who always knows, like, oh, I'm picking up Rachel today. And...
Right. Just like hiring somebody to and they could just sit there while I'm in my sessions, It's really just they have to drive me around and they have to deal with LA traffic.
Yes. Or a jetpack. That could be fun too. A jetpack.
Or a teleporter,
Yes.
How can I get around LA without a car?
Well, and in all seriousness, you did mention that you have picked up with more telepractice as well. Is that accurate? So you might be doing more consulting via like we are right now, so sort of a video conferencing tool?
Yeah, and it's been so effective. It's really interesting because a lot of what I do is I troubleshoot, right? A lot of the families that are contacting me, this ain't their first rodeo as far as speech is concerned. They've had tons of speech therapists, tons of different people giving them advice. And so I really dive in and I say, okay, what's working? What's not working? How can we make those things work? You know, and of course, bringing in the knowledge that I have of AAC and technology and autism and all of these things that I have learned over the years. But it's actually really interesting how I can help from afar. I have lots of clients in not just California, but I've worked with people all over the world. And it's really great because I feel like I actually can help guide and coach them, teach them what I know about vocabulary and how to be strategic, give them ideas on how to implement. You know, it's the same types of coaching procedures that I would go through with families that I work with in real life, in person. But it's been interesting. I also have been using video modeling as a way to kind of look back and coach caregivers on, you like, see right there, like, what could we have done in that situation? Like, what would you have done next time? And they're like, oh, like I should have paused more. Free, you should have paused more, And so things like that, it's so cool how we can use technology to help support a process like that.
Well, and you just touched upon it, the difference between coaching and consulting, right? When you ask people questions and they reflect upon that and they have the video right there that they're watching together with you, that's like true coaching because it's letting people discover what they should do from the inside. Where consulting, you'd be like, okay, here's what you do. You need to expand right now. This is how you do an expansion or something like that.
Mm-hmm. I actually was doing a coaching session with a family last week, and the mom was so wonderful. She was completely honest. She's like, I haven't touched the device all month since we saw you last. I have not touched the device. I found out you were coming this week, and I started getting frantic, like, oh no, I haven't done any of my homework. And one, I appreciated her honesty, right? Because it's like, I'm not here to be like, the mean school teacher that's like, you didn't do your homework, you're in trouble. I'm here to help figure out how can we do better next month, And so it was interesting because one of the things that she said to me was, I realized that, we had talked about potentially using the device at mealtime. And she said, I realized when all the other kids are around, it's not the best time for me to use the device. I'm too overwhelmed. Too many things are happening. It needs to be when I have one-on-one time with my son. And I said, great. Like, what is one time of day or time of week that you have one-on-one time with him? And she's like, every Saturday we go to the beach in the morning really early. And I said, perfect. She's like, I've thought about the device though. It's not like the best for the beach. It's like, we don't even need to take the device to the beach, but we need to talk about going to the beach before we go. We need to talk about going to the car before we go. We need to talk about going to the grocery store after the beach. We need to talk about going home. I was like, you can keep the device in the car if you want to, but like, there's so many opportunities to talk about where you're going. And she's like, oh, great. She's like, I can start it tomorrow. And so anyway, I wanted to share that story because it was really great that she had the insight to figure out what we decided on last month. It's not working for me. And here's why.
That's awesome. That is so awesome that she can now move from where she was to where she needs to be, right? So she was at 0 and now she's at 1 and she continue to move on. So that's fantastic.
Yeah, I know. I felt really good after the session. And it's like things like that where it feels very rewarding to be able to help guide the process, right? Like, it's not, like you said, me coming in and being like, do this, right? It's like brainstorming, it's troubleshooting. It's like, well, do you think this might work for you? And of course, it's using routines-based intervention to figure out how can I integrate into an already existing routine, because that's how we know it's more likely to stick.
So Rachel, back to the aggressive behaviors episode for a second. A lot of people reached out. There was a lot of activity on the Facebook group. If you have not been to the Facebook group, we suggest you head over there because there is people sharing their story and their own experiences and their own perspectives. And a lot of people were commenting on that episode in particular.
Yeah. And I just want to thank everybody who listened and everybody who reached out. It really touched my heart in a special way. And we aren't alone. And I think that's one of the great things about this podcast is that while we might be in a school and, kind of doing our own thing, not interacting with a lot of SLPs, our hope for this podcast is that it's a place where we can all come together and share our experiences. And so there's no better place to do that than our Facebook group. So definitely join it if you haven't already. It's a really great place. And again, thank you guys so much for all the support. I felt so loved and I just don't feel alone, which is one of the best feelings in the world.
Now, you also were not alone when you did this interview today. So who's the interview with today?
So I had the pleasure of interviewing Lisa Erwin-Davidson. She is doing really amazing research. She's local to California, and she was connected to me through one of my local reps. And what an amazing experience. This interview was really great. She shared so much insight into AAC and all the work that she's doing as far as research. So I'm really excited to share the interview with you guys. She had a lot of really great strategies that she uses, and just her perspectives were really spot on.
So without further ado, let's listen to Rachel's interview with Lisa Erwin-Davidson.
Welcome to Talking with Tech. I'm your host, Rachel Madel, joined today by Lisa Erwin-Davidson. Lisa, how are you?
I'm fine. It's great to be here.
I am so excited to have you on our podcast and talk to you all about the work that you're doing. So just start off by introducing yourself to our listeners and telling us a little bit about what you do and how you started doing what you do.
Started doing what I do. Well, I can tell you, and this may age me a little bit, but I was at the forefront of AAC starting in 1984. So when the International Society for Augmentative and Alternative Communication was going, when USAC wasn't even going at that point, was when I jumped in, thanks to a wonderful mentor that I had out in Syracuse, New York. So I had the pleasure and privilege of doing an internship project with Dr. Bruce Baker at the time when semantic compaction was just coming to the fore, and speech generating devices were becoming, invented. They were starting to figure out how do we implement these devices with a type of semantic compaction system or with symbols that would allow the person to communicate more efficiently, and not just to communicate, but also to learn language and to be literate. And so that experience at that Cerebral Palsy Center really struck a chord with me. And even being able to sit with occupational therapists and physical therapists and working with 2-year-olds all the way up to adults sort of set the tone for how I wanted to proceed with the rest of my career.
I love that. And so I love having clinicians on and researchers who have a lot of experience. They kind of have seen the evolution of AAC and our field. What do you think is there anything that has changed for the best? Is there anything that you kind of wish we could kind of go back and do a little bit differently? What is your perspective on that kind of evolution of this field?
That's a huge question, Rachel. It's a huge question. I'll say that some of the positives that I've seen over the last 30 years are the ability, or that the insurance companies are more likely to pay for speech generating devices than they had when we first started. I mean, our first struggles with insurance companies and Medicaid was really in the mid to late 80s, all the way into the 90s. Lou Golinker, who's an attorney to help work with insurance companies and Medicaid to make sure that our devices were legally covered, made a huge difference in our field. So I think even though we all have complaints and there are always issues around getting devices approved, we now have vendors who can help us through these device evaluations and who dot all the I's and cross all the T's to help clinicians out there to get their clients the devices that they need. So that's been a big piece.
Yeah. And that, I think a lot of ways, these companies have made it very easy, right? They kind of have been through they know all the insurance companies, they know all the like hoops that they have to jump through. They know, if it's going to be denied, why and how to respond to that, so it's just, they have kind of taken probably a lot of the legwork out of it, which is nice because we want our clients to get devices and we want them to get them funded.
Right. And also from what I'm hearing from the graduate students, that it actually eases some of their anxiety around thinking, oh gosh, I'm the only one that has to do this, or I don't have any help, or where am I supposed to start? And I want to make sure I'm doing the right thing for my client. And I think that hearing that the vendors are available and more than willing to help out speech language pathologists in their evaluations has been huge for this field.
Yeah, and it's more of a collaboration, right? I think it's a lot of weight to put on a clinician's back. You have to do this intense assessment and figure out what's the right system and how to implement it and how to program it and all these things, when we know there's a lot of different technologies out there now. New AAC technologies are coming out. Every time I go to a different conference, I see a new booth with somebody else starting an app or have some type of technology, and so it's kind of hard to keep up in a lot of ways. And so it's nice to ease that burden a little bit. It's not just me making a decision. It should be a team approach.
Yeah. And I think, the other question you asked was, what are some of the problems that continue to exist or rear their ugly heads? And I would say that probably the barriers still exist, and in particular, the practice barriers. If you're working in a school and you're a school speech language pathologist and you have done, and your client really well and know that they could benefit from a speech generating device, how do you overcome the barrier to getting the evaluation done, and then how long you may have to wait for that child, that student, to actually get a device in their hands. And, where I would say that these systemic barriers are one of the most problematic components of AAC that continue to exist. And the second barrier that I see, which may work out in the long run, but there's this sort of a controversy, I think, right now in the field of AAC around how children learn language and how are we going to approach the instruction of language using graphic symbols, and what is the best way to go about it. You may have been following the AAC for the SLP that's actually administered by my friend Catherine Dorney. Hey, Catherine. But yeah, I think that's been quite evident when you look through the threads at how there's just this discussion, this argument over what is the best way that these children with complex communication needs should be learning language. And that's, something that's very important for research. We need to know what are those components for teaching language. If we're going to do aided language input or aided language modeling, how does that occur, and what is your underlying philosophy? What is your underlying epistemology that leads you down that path to that more socially constructed approach, where if you sort of adhere to more of the behavioral approach, your way that you're going to be teaching that child to learn those graphic symbols may be entirely different. So, learning language and learning behaviors is different. It's different. So we have to come to a continued agreement or discussion about how we're going to do this right for our clients, especially for our school-age kids.
No, absolutely. And I'm in that Facebook group, and there's a lot of heated discussions oftentimes. And, when you go through and you read through those discussions, you just can see how people are coming from completely different theoretical models, right, of language development. And so I think that it's important to learn more about that. We know we don't have enough research in those areas. I'm really interested in autism. We just had Charlotte DeStefano on. She's a UCLA researcher, and she was talking about, a lot of her passion and her research is geared towards how children with autism learn language, because it's not, a typical process. We're finding that, the way children with autism learn language is completely different than children who are language delayed or children with other diagnoses. And so, there's all these kind of nuanced implications that we need to kind of sort through. And I think we probably both can agree we need more research.
Right. And that's actually the reason I went into this whole thing, because after practicing for so many years, I collected a lot of questions, right? Things that I wanted to investigate. And it came to the point where I was lucky enough to go to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. and study under a person I've admired for years, and it's Dr. Karen Erickson. And that was a really good way to, I guess, develop my questions and to make sure that I was very focused and to really have the opportunity and the time to hone those questions to some of those pieces that are really important for the field. So, you can be overwhelmed because there are so many questions, like you can just do this for the rest of your life. But where I had seen some difficulties was the AAC implementation in special education schools or in self-contained classrooms versus what it was like in inclusive classrooms. So I was looking at, how the teacher's instruction changes when they are learning a different communication system. I was really interested in how children with complex communication needs learn core concept words that when they have very complicated bodies and may never have learned to reach or grasp and manipulate things or move around their environment. And that made me sort of dig into the research in occupational science and learned a lot about how they view children's engagement with the world and engagement with objects when they have these complex bodies. And so there's, interesting theoretical bases for these. And that's what I want to do, is to sort of take a step back and go to where children with complex communication needs are beginning to learn language. Where is one of the first place, and what is that age where they should be really enacting those very, very early concepts that they might have learned or comprehended earlier, but how are they going to express it? And where do they express it? And so this led me to the preschool age, because children between 3 and 5, they're going to be in these classrooms and experiencing communication with their peers and going to be involved in instructional routines and learning basic concepts. And the words to talk about them is a huge component of any preschool curricula. So, the one state in the country that has universal preschool is Vermont. And so my dissertation was studying 4 preschool classrooms that are that accept children with disabilities from their community. And they've been included. They've been doing that since 2014. And to look at how high quality preschools and exemplary teachers, how do they teach concepts, these core concepts, to children with and without complex communication needs? Do they do something different? How do they teach concepts if some of the children in the class don't have speech and don't have graphic representation for language? Mm-hmm. And so to me, that was a place to really to look at the origin, and then to take that information into other age groups later on.
You make a really great point, Lisa. I'm thinking about multimodality learning, right? We know that children learn when they're engaging all of their senses and their bodies. And, children with complex communication needs, like you said, they have complex bodies oftentimes that, they can't manipulate objects. They can't move around a classroom. And so it's really interesting to think about, how does that impact a child's ability to, start utilizing language, especially if they have no expressive language. And so it's just interesting how that manifests. Was there any, indications that you found of, how this kind of unfolds in classrooms and with children?
Yeah, it was actually really interesting because, just to take a little step back first, I had done a year-long qualitative research study, what's called an intrinsic case study, in a self-contained classroom with my research team at CLDS for about 8 months. So I had that information and how the classroom context changed, how instructional style of the teacher changed when you introduce core concept words, a core vocabulary, right? Called the universal core. So then I wanted to say, okay, I know about what's happening in this type of environment, so let me take it into an inclusive classroom and see how, if there are any differences, how do concepts develop in these inclusive classrooms when you have a lot of speech going around and the teachers are qualified to go back and forth between kids with disabilities and not. So how do they teach these concepts? So What was really interesting is I compared 4 different classrooms, and I was in there for a prolonged period of time. So it was a 12-week study, and it was a cross-case analysis, which was exploratory. So again, asking the question, how are these children learning in these naturalistic environments? How do they learn these basic concept words? And what I did find, one of the takeaways was that if a teacher understood about how to instruct one, and from a socially constructed standpoint, that she understood an interactional framework, that she came from a dynamic frame of learning, that she really got Vygotsky, right? That she really got experiential learning, that teacher would be able to infuse the graphic symbols and the graphic language into all of her routines, into all of her instructions, and did what she could to teach the child with complex communication needs these basic concept words. But number one, to do that, the child had to have an aided language system. The children who had core concept words and not a lot of nouns on their communication systems, but the words that would allow them to cross-contextually communicate. So these are not context-constrained words. They were the ones that became symbolic, emerging symbolic communicators. They were the ones who, some of them actually started to speak. They were the ones who were very communicative with their peers and were able to demonstrate that they understood some of these core concepts. So in particular, there's this group or this subgroup of basic concepts, and they're called conceptual relational words. And these conceptual relational words create these semantic linkages when between nouns. So you think of these words, I call them CRWs, but they're the glue words between nouns. And there's 5 types of them. And I'll give you an example. One, they're called spatial relational, conceptual relational words. So spatial relational words. And these are words like in and out, up and down, and even here and there. What I found was that both children with and without complex communication needs used these CRWs extensively throughout their day. And in certain activities that involved very flexible thinking and flexible learning, like playing with water and experimenting and exploring how different objects and sand, things that are very flexible, that you have to be able to understand and use these core spatial relational concepts. And if they weren't able to say them, at least they had opportunities to understand them, right? And so these were very powerful activities for teachers and speech pathologists and occupational therapists to work together to teach all the children these core concept words that have to do with spatial relationships. So it's taking our thinking, it's thinking differently about how we approach the language. It's taking it away from a grammatical function and putting it into more of a cognitive and sensory motor thinking. What are these relational words that give the child an understanding and a power to talk about how words that match how their body moves. So the children were learning these words in the ways that their body experienced the world.
That's amazing. What you're saying, it makes total sense to me, because I feel like, we obviously know the importance of core words and how those concepts, we need to show kids how to use them multiple times through lots of experiences in order for it to solidify. But the other thing is it's really great as a way to direct the actions of others, right? So like being able to say in and seeing somebody put something in, you might not be able to physically do that with your own body, but having the power to access a communication, system that allows you to say that is really motivating for kids, for kids who don't always have, fine motor control or even gross motor control sometimes. I think that's a really powerful thing.
Right. And I think for clinicians, there's so many different things I could say about the study that were just well, they were interesting to me anyway, but for when I think about what clinicians can do when they go out into the field, is to really pay close attention to how children's bodies move and how they're interacting with the objects in their physical world, and to match what their bodies are able to do with these particular concepts. So these may be attributive relational words, like the shape, the size, the weight, the quantity of things. For example, words like same and different, or some and all, right? That's extremely important for these children who may not be able to see patterns. They may not be able to hear other kids talking about the differences between objects. And they may only learn same and different from being able to manipulate them and having somebody attribute that communicative meaning to these object differences. So whatever their bodies can do, pay attention to it, because the concepts are taught by how their bodies interact with these physical objects. And we know some of these kids in preschool, right? They can't reach yet. They can't grasp. They're too involved. So what can you do to teach the concepts of same and different, which are really, really learned early, with children who have these complex bodies, and to think about, wow, this is a really important concept to teach, but how am I going to teach this given what their body can or can't do?
And I think an additional layer too is that for a classroom teacher, especially, or, clinicians who are doing push-in therapy or group therapy, how can we kind of, both teach an entire classroom, but also hone in on individual students to kind of help individualize. And I think that's one of the hardest things about, classrooms, where there's children with lots of different varying skill levels. And so it's kind of figuring out a way to both individualize, but also integrate into a group lesson, for example.
Yeah, one of the things that one particular teacher did, which was, I thought, pretty powerful, is that she had downloaded a 36 universal core board. And for one student who'd come in who was pre-symbolic, he was suspected of being on the autism spectrum, had all sort of your typical behaviors, wasn't showing that he was even aware of children in his environment. And she didn't know all the details about how to do aided language modeling, but she knew enough where she copied off that board and she just started modeling in the way that she knew how. And she taught her instructional assistant how to do it. And then she made numerous copies for all the children in the classroom. What she made clear to all her students is that I don't care how you voice or what your voice is, everybody has a different voice. And so just from the way that she presented this aided AAC system, and then how she used it in all her settings, it didn't matter. All the children had equal access to these concept words, and all of them are participating in helping this little boy learn the underlying words underneath these graphic symbols. So the graphic symbol is just like a visual perceptual characteristic, right? It's the important thing is the word that underlies that graphic symbol, and to make sure that word is not contextually constrained. That word can be used across many, many situations and environments. And that's indeed the power that this teacher had. She knew that. Even though this was not an intervention study, right? I was just watching her to see what played out. But just by her doing that, that student began to speak words and began to independently use his universal core board within 2 weeks.
Wow.
Because look at the massive amount of input that he had available, right? So the special educator had come in, and she sometimes used the board in her individual sessions. There was a speech aide in the room who was using that board a lot across different contexts that all the kids were involved in. But I think the most powerful thing is that the teachers, right, the classroom teachers were modeling and allowing the children in the classroom to model these words too. And the kids picked up on it unbelievably.
Exactly. And we know the power of peers, right? It's like, I tell this to clinicians all the time. It's just like, we can never teach as well as a peer can teach. And so it's so amazing to hear that these special educators understand the importance of that and incorporate their entire classroom in. Not only do I think that helps with children progressing, as far as their speech and language and their, communication, but I also think just from a social standpoint, from a pure acceptance standpoint, it kind of levels the playing field, right? And it's just, it's really important because, I've been in those classrooms where, the child who's using a device is the child who's using a device. Mm-hmm. It's not integrated, and a lot of times we're not even having conversations with the entire classroom about how the student is using a device. I sit at circle time, especially with those preschoolers, and like all the little preschoolers come over and start touching the device because they're used to seeing an iPad, at home or what have you. And so it's just important to think through that lens and just get the entire classroom involved.
Right. And what I found, and it's not just what I found, but I think the entire team of the Center for Literacy and Disability Studies, they're doing such groundbreaking work in implementation science right now, but and I'm sure they're going to be at ASHA and talk about some of their more current results. But I think what we all sort of agreed with was that it's the word that's on that device that carries the meaning, right? The most important thing about these devices is what words you have in these devices. And as speech pathologists, I think we've done a disservice when it comes to implementing communication devices in the classroom, because we use a lot of lingo that we don't even know that we're doing. And this was a big thing I learned in the graduate program was, whoa, Lisa, you're still using a lot of this like SLP lingo stuff. And when I began to adopt the language of the classroom teachers, so example will be using, talk about words and how children learn words versus, well, I'm going to develop this vocabulary for this particular thing. It started to really resonate, with some of the teachers. And when I went back and taught the preschool teachers that I'd done my study with, and that's part of my dissemination, the teachers had really good questions. And they hadn't realized that these communication systems carried the power of words. Now you think that's sort of intuitive in our world, right? But there was a lot of confusion between the pictures on visual supports for self-regulation and behavior management and the pictures used for language development and facilitating communication. And that was one of the takeaways too, is that the teachers were almost like blown away by, oh my gosh, I never really thought about that. It's not, these graphic symbols should be used really for teaching language. And I was only using these graphic symbols for visual supports. And I think, especially when we serve children with autism, is that we really have to think carefully about why we are using these graphic symbols. Are we truly thinking about the words that underlie those symbols? And then finally, how are we teaching these words that the children will learn them, right? So they can develop their language.
Exactly. And I think that there's a lot of sometimes discussion around what symbol, and I don't know if that symbol looks like that word. I get that a lot when I go into classrooms or I'm working with, families, and it's not, like you said, it's not about the symbol. The symbol obviously is important, and that graphic is important because we need a visual representation of the language so that children who are not able to speak verbally can access that language. But it's about the word, right? And that's where when we're talking with clinicians who might not have experience with AAC or don't know a lot about AAC, you know a lot about language, right? You know how to teach children how to communicate. You know about language development. It's the same thing in a lot of ways. Of course, there's a few differences, but teaching the words and in intrinsically motivating ways, that's how children learn language.
Right.
All children.
Yeah, and so making sure that they have, and I'm putting this in quotes, but the right words, right? So that you're really thinking about how the children with these complex bodies can learn the concept words that will give them the power to combine language, right? We have too many children who are just using or pointing to or indicating in some way one symbol, one word. Our whole modus operandi is to make sure that we're helping them combine words. Words become phrases, words become sentences, whatever, right?
So
yeah, one other point. Go ahead, because I had another really important point.
Think about it, Lisa. Think about it. What I was going to ask is, when we're thinking about vocabulary, right? Especially for a child who is emerging in symbolic understanding. Where do we go? Because I think that when you were talking about the Facebook groups, right? And I feel like this is the discussion. It's the core versus fringe. Where do you start? How would you answer that question?
So fortunately, there were much greater minds than mine who started thinking about this. And I'm going to go to Lois Bloom and some of the Bloom and Leahy material, but she talks about, and has a really good article about, it's called Against the Noun Bias. And her point was that if you really listened and took really good data on what children are talking about as they're developing language, you begin to notice that it's not a bunch of nouns. Yes, the children may see the nouns if you have normal vision. Parents talk about nouns because you point to them and you name them as part of what you do. I have 4 kids, so believe me, I know what that is like. But what is it? What are the words that children are really using to carry salience, to carry that semantic meaning, right? And most of them are what she termed relational words. And that was one of the places where I got this sort of conceptual relational word concept. But developmental psychologists, educational psychologists were really the ones to talk about conceptual relational words, and that how those words carry so much meaning across contexts, right? And so you think about, gosh, what are those words that I should be teaching this 15-month-old who's, completely nonverbal, she's maybe saying a few sounds. Well, let me go back, and I'm going to look at these conceptual relational words because she's moving her body in such a way, or she's manipulating these objects this way. This might be a really good time to teach her the 2 concepts, same and different. Right? This is a very, very early learned concept. I mean, children in some of the research at 3 months of age, by kicking their leg, can determine between what is same and different. And really, your brain is set up evolutionary wise to recognize the familiar versus the unfamiliar, right? The poisonous versus the not poisonous. And so these concepts we don't think about, but they're very early in our receptive understanding. And so for the children who don't experience the world in the same way, it's really important to teach them things like same and different, or up and down, right? How's their body moving, in and out, here and there. You don't have to have a picture of an object if their eyes are looking at an object or they're gesturing toward an object. The word here can be used much more flexibly than the name of the object. Mm-hmm. And indeed, my research across classrooms showed exactly that children were using in these mutually, in these environments where they were very close socially anyway, so few nouns were used across all classrooms. What was used? Here and there, this and that, it, okay? So those words, which we call are maybe determiners, but they refer to the object that we are mutually referring to, right? And I'm telling you, even the children who had severe, what I'll call severe autism, they did not appear to be following gaze. But particularly one of the boys would stand back and he would circle around and he would indirectly watch how these children were moving objects and what they were saying. And then he would go to his communication board and try to understand how that word matched what the students were doing, right? That wasn't like a search and find technique. It was through his indirect observation that he was actually picking up the graphic language and learning those concept words. So, this is a really critical point, which, begs to have more research being done, which is, what my plan is. But I thought it was very exciting because it was more evidence based on some evidence done in other fields since the 1970s that speaks to the power of these conceptual relational words.
The other thing I think is important is that when we're thinking about communication partners, teachers, paraprofessionals, other clinicians, when we're thinking about the way that they facilitate language, most people go straight to nouns, right? That's something that is a natural thing, because most children start off by requesting, right? That's where we start with the motivating things that children want to do or see or play with or eat. So I think that, our job as clinicians is really to just broaden that perspective. We don't need to focus so much on nouns because that's already happening, right? It's like we need to shift that focus. We need to teach the power of core word vocabulary, because naturally the nouns come, right? These things come. I think it's the core words that, teachers and paraprofessionals especially have a really hard time thinking through, how would I teach this, right? And so I think that's where we can come in as clinicians and really dive into that process to integrate into those routines that are already happening and see all the ways that we can use this one concept.
Right.
And so I think that that's an important thing too, is just, nouns are happening naturally.
Well, and I think the important point is, some of the early researchers talked about pre-syntactic language, and we talk about pre-symbolic language. It's pretty much the same thing, right? Before children have enough words to start linking different grammatical functions. So start linking subject, verb, object, start linking whatever their language is. And so what we're talking about when we talk about where do I begin are these children who are pre-symbolic, right? And this is critical. You can't stop a child from speaking about a noun once they start having words to refer to these nouns. But if you want to really teach a child who doesn't have speech yet, who doesn't have language yet, the salience is carried on these concept words. And you can always have the pictures or the real objects there to refer to. But what power you give the child to learn the glue words between these nouns, right? Mm-hmm. That just gives a lot of cross-contextual power.
I love that. Yeah. And I always talk about that glue, right? You can't make sentences with the nouns. Right. They can be a part of a sentence, but you can't put a bunch of nouns together and have a sentence.
Right. Exactly.
And that's where, especially for children with autism, I feel like that's where I meet so many children. They have huge vocabularies of nouns, and, they might have a few, carrier phrases, I want, or let's play, or give me, but they truly don't understand in a lot of ways these concepts. And so they memorize them, they script them, and they just, everyone's confused as to why they don't have functional, spontaneous language.
Right. Well, it's because it's our fault. It's
exactly.
It's the fault of speech pathologists. I think we've all done. I think, and I go back. I started out doing the search and find techniques, or show me this, show me that, or point to this and point to that. But children with autism, especially, they become very good at maybe following that direction and expecting and predicting what they can point to just to make you go away. Right?
Yep.
So this SLP will go away if I just point at this picture and look away. I have no idea what I'm looking at, but what the heck,
Exactly.
I just got contingently reinforced for picking the picture of a goldfish.
Yep.
So what are we teaching them? Well, you've got to teach them to talk about that goldfish, right? And not just yum or yuck, but put down, or take out, or go away. It's those concept words again that speak to the relationship among objects that are the most salient, that are, and we're still learning this. I got a lot of research to do yet, but I think that's what we all need to take away from this is to try to think carefully about the language that you're teaching, not training. We're not going to use that word train. I'm not training you to point to that word. I want to teach you the language to express the relationship and build your language for all those 4 functions of communication, right? Mm-hmm. And what words do most kids say first? It's no. And how many communication boards do we see, Rachel, that don't even have the word no or not on it?
Okay? I know. It's one of the first things I teach, because kids oftentimes want to not do work, not have something, not eat a certain food. And so it's powerful. And, it's a perfect example of, exactly, babies start using that word, right off the bat. As soon as they start saying words, no is one of the first ones that come out. And so it's just, there's such a disconnect in a lot of ways with what we see with natural language development and for the children that have complex communication needs. And it's because, we are the people in charge of, the vocabulary and the access to that visual language.
Right.
So I'm really curious, Lisa, what's next for you? What's on the horizon?
Oh, so there's a lot of stuff. I'm having a great time teaching the AAC seminar, which is a mandatory class here at CSUF. I'm developing community partnerships. One of the things that I'm really drawn toward is community engaged scholarship. So before I even came here, I started reaching out to develop partnerships with different agencies. I have something on the burner with Head Start. They have about 25 facilities here in Orange County. I just had a wonderful conversation today with the Fullerton School District, the preschool program, the early childhood program here. They are stoked to start a relationship. So I think there's so much to be done in these preschool classrooms to extend my research and also to help them, right? It's some mutual benefit. I'll be able to teach the teachers. I'll be able to get my students into these classrooms to learn from these expert teachers. So that's a really exciting part. I've got some interdisciplinary interprofessional practice and education stuff that I'm involved in. And then that third tier is the pre-service education for the students and to help them learn about AAC. So yeah, I intend to be here for a long time, and who knows whether I'll be successful or not, but we'll see.
Well, you're already doing amazing work, and I'm so happy that you were able to come on today to share all of your experience, and your dissertation is fantastic. Is there a way for people to follow your work or read the research that you've done?
Yeah, well, so I do have a website. It's lisaac.com. Yeah, and people can reach out to me through Cal State University Fullerton. I'm easily accessible from the Communication Disorders Department website. And I'd love to hear from other people in Orange County. I think just building my network here in California, which is huge,
it's really true. Exciting. We got a big state here.
Big state.
Well, Lisa, thank you so much for coming on. I'm so excited to hit up your website. We'll definitely link to that in the show notes for everybody to view your work. Thank you again for taking the time out of your day. It was so enlightening in a lot of ways, and you're doing really amazing things. So we appreciate it. Thank you so much,
Rachel.
Of course. So for Talking with Tech, I am Rachel Madel. I will talk to you guys next week.
Hi, I'm Matt Hott, one of the hosts of Speech Science, a weekly podcast bringing you all the information that you can handle related to speech sciences and disabilities. Michelle Wintering, Michael McLeod, and I interview leaders and difference makers in the field. Every Tuesday, we drop a new episode. You can find us on iTunes, Android, and on our website, www.speechscience.org/Speech Science Podcast. Join us as we try to find the answers to the question,
what is communication?
You're listening to the Exceptional Podcast Network.